Welcome to Cora's Cottage, where things are homegrown and handmade. I started my journey in town on a small city lot where I grew a garden and preserved most of what I grew. While I was in town, I continued to learn kitchen and other homemaking skills. However, recently, my husband and I have had the opportunity to move out into the country. This means we have more space, and I will be expanding my garden and preservation skills this summer. I want to continue to expand my homesteading and homemaking skills as well. Follow along with me on this journey as I share what I learn. It's that time of year when the garden produce are exploding and they are on every surface and every shelf of the refrigerator. So what I'm dealing with today are cucumbers, so I'm just going to wash them up here while I go through a couple of things that I have either heard or used myself to can pickles successfully and keep them nice and crunchy. Now, the first thing that I have heard and I've started doing, and it does make a big difference, is choosing smaller cucumbers for turning into pickles, or picking your cucumbers smaller to turn into pickles. The reason for this is cucumbers have a very high water content, and the bigger they are, the more water content they have. If you've ever cut into a cucumber and you can see in the middle there is that kind of watery flesh right around the seeds, and then you get out farther and you have that more solid flesh. So all of that right around the seeds is high water content, and that will turn to mush when you turn it into a pickle. So your trick for them not getting that or not having as much of that is to pick them when they're smaller. I find the ideal size to be the line of pickles that you can kind of see right next to the sink here. That tends to be about the perfect size. They fit well in a quart jar, and they are ideal because they do not get mushy when you can them and turn them into a pickle. Another thing I have heard is that taking off the blossom end of the cucumber before canning it and turning it into a pickle. Now, I've never struggled with this personally, causing my pickles to be mushy, but if you're struggling with that, it might be something to try. Now, one thing I will say is I am very diligent when I wash them, that I am making sure that I get every bit of that blossom off the end of each cucumber, so I don't know if that's enough to keep them from turning mushy or not. Other tricks I have heard is adding some sort of agent to your jar that helps keep the pickles crispy. I've heard grape leaves. I've also heard that maybe maple leaves, some tree, it might have been oak, I can't remember exactly. But there are different leaves from fairly common trees and grape leaves that you can add to the jar that help to keep them crispy. I've especially seen people do this with fermented pickles to help hold them down beneath the brine. So that's something else you might explore if you're having issues with keeping your pickles nice and crunchy. Now, full disclosure, I have never used either of those methods, but they are something to consider if you're struggling. Now, the other thing that I do to help my pickles seal and stay so that they are crunchy is I use Ruth Ann Zimmerman's method, and I will link her account down below along with the specific video if I can find it, where she talks about how she cans her pickles. So what she does is she puts them into a water bath canner and brings them just to a boil, and then she shuts them off and removes them from the water. I've started doing this year because my previous methods that I've used in the past, while I get crunchy pickles, they do not seal well. So I end up with a whole bunch of pickles in my refrigerator taking up space, and that is not what I want. I never have enough refrigerator space the way it is, so ideally I would fix that problem by having my jars actually seal. So I've been using Ruth Ann Zimmerman's method this year, and my seal rate has been phenomenal. So now that I have all of my cucumbers washed and ready to go into jars, I'm going to prep my jars. So I use this pre-diced, pre-minced garlic this year just because it's simpler, but you can use whole cloves as well. And then I'm just using some dill weed that I had purchased because my dill completely failed this year. So I do about a teaspoon to 2 teaspoons per quart jar of the dill weed, and I do about 1 heaping tablespoon of garlic. And then I go ahead and I pack my jars with my cucumbers. This is a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle. You want to get them in there as tightly as possible, and you might have to play around with what works best for you. Sometimes I have my pickles going horizontally like I am doing in this jar. Sometimes I have them going vertically. It just depends on what pickles I have and how I think I can get them to fit best into the jar. Like I said, it's like doing a puzzle or a game of Jenga. You got to kind of work at it and figure out over time what works best. Something else I will say is that it's best to keep your pickles all about the same size so that they will all process at the same rate. So if you're doing a bunch of small pickles like this, try to keep it to small pickles. If you're doing larger ones, try to stick to larger ones. I have done mixed jars before, and that does work, but your pickles are a little bit different in texture and taste, the big ones from the little ones, even coming out of the same jar, just because it takes the bigger pickles longer and the smaller pickles a shorter amount of time. So that's something to keep in mind when you're packing your jars. For a big 2-quart jar like this one, I'm just going to double those amounts. So I did 2 heaping teaspoons, which is just a teaspoon from the table, and I am going to do some dill in there as well. Now, I had messed up and I had tried to put these into a quart jar and they did not fit. So I'm transferring over my garlic here so that I'm not wasting it, because these larger pickles were too big for my quart jar. So that's something to keep in mind. If you are picking certain cucumbers out to stuff your jars, make sure that you're picking ones that will actually fit in the jar. So do a test, like hold it up next to the jar and see if it's too long. If you aren't using a pickling cucumber, it is very likely that they can get too tall for a quart jar pretty quickly. But otherwise, I use the exact same process as I would for a quart jar. I just make my garlic and dill weed and any other spices, I just double them for what I would for a quart. You can absolutely add in pickling spices if you would like, or some red pepper flakes to add some heat, or even some jalapenos. I've done that in the past, but we have a toddler who is obsessed with pickles, so I'm leaving out the spice this year and just canning some plain Jane dill pickles. While I am stuffing all of the jars with the cucumbers, I like to have my brine on the stove working towards a boil so that it can dissolve all of the salt. So for my brine, I use 3 quarts of water, 1 quart of vinegar, and 1 cup of salt, and I bring all of that to a boil just so that it can dissolve the salt. Now, I like to use just my regular salt that I use for everything else. I use Redmond's Real Salt, which I will link in the description, but you can use a pickling salt if you would prefer. Now, one thing that I've heard as a benefit to using pickling salt is sometimes it can keep your brine from being cloudy. And the other thing you want to be cognizant of is that you want to make sure that your salt isn't iodized. So I'm just going to stir this until I am sure that that salt is completely dissolved. And then it's going to be time to transfer my jars over here so that I can put that hot boiling brine into my pickles. Now, I forgot to video actually putting the brine over these, but I just pour it into that funnel, and then I go ahead and take it off and I wipe all of my rims after I've debubbled them to make sure that I get any air bubbles up. I just use a little wooden skewer for this. Then I'm going to go ahead and add my lids once I'm sure that my tops of my jars, my rims are clean, and then I go ahead and I add on my rings fingertip tight. So this is turned on just until you get that resistance. Then into my canner they go. I've had this going so it's nice warm water in here. It's just shy of a boil at this point because I want my product and my canner to be about the same temperature. And then I'm just going to lower that down in to the water and add my last jar because I overfilled my canner, so I had to ladle out some water so that my jars would fit. Then, like I said before, I bring this just to a rolling boil, which is when you can take the lid off and it continues to boil. Then I pull them up out of that water and move them to set them on a towel on the counter. I use a towel just to protect the counter from any burn marks or from any product or anything that might be on the outside of the jars, so I don't have a sticky counter. It's a much easier way to clean up, and like I said, it protects my counter from these hot jars. I'll leave these jars to sit for 12 to 24 hours before I go ahead and I check their seal, wipe them down, label them, and place them into storage for the winter.